Tonight on Nova.
1, 0, and liftoff.
The shuttle Discovery put America back in space.
Discovery clears the tower.
But where are we headed? Our goals in space are set by presidents.
Of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Now, many nations compete with us in space. How will America's 41st president meet the challenge? Can the next president win the space race?
Funding for NOVA is provided by Prime Computer, supplying integrated computer solutions to the world's manufacturing, commercial, technical, and scientific marketplaces. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide.
It was a political decision by a president that took Americans to the moon. And it was a political decision by a president that chose the shuttle and brought us triumph and tragedy. And triumphs yet to come. In 1989, the new American president will face many hard choices about what to do in space. Choices about funding the space station, helping American aerospace companies compete against new international rivals, and making sure this nation is never again grounded by accidents or misguided policy. There will have to be decisions on deploying Star Wars and exploring other worlds. These are choices that remain just as critical now that Discovery has flown.
One successful shuttle launch will not the next programs make by a long shot.
And liftoff. Liftoff.
And in fact, shuttle and space station are really just steps to something, and the country still needs to decide what that something is.
104%.
We would not want people to think that one successful flight means that all is cured, because that's only a most visible manifestation of getting the program back on track. But our concern is for the long term. It takes a commitment of decades in the space program.
Why is a space program important?
Space is vital to the future of this country. It's vital to the technological base of our country. It's vital to our leadership and technology around the world, and we can't afford to lose that.
I worry, however, that this country, whose whole being, whose whole prosperity is based on science and technology, seems to be currently losing that thrust.
On the long campaign trail, Republican presidential candidate George Bush presented his space policy at the Marshall Space Flight Center.
In very basic ways, our exploration of space defines us as a people. Our willingness to take great risks for great rewards, to challenge the unknown.
In August 1988, Democrat Michael Dukakis visited a mock-up of the planned space station and outlined his position.
Our friends, today is in 1960. We stand at a crossroads. Today is then. It is time to take longer strides. To rekindle the American spirit of invention and of daring. To look to the stars, not for direction, but for inspiration. And to look inside ourselves for the determination to make this nation of ours #1 again.
I don't want to see us ever lay down our technological lead. It's not just that we wave our fingers in the air like we do after a football game, say, we're #1, we're #1. It goes far deeper than that. The nation as #1 in research controls its own future, has its own options for the future as to what it wants to decide to do. It doesn't have to depend on some other country.
NASA can be a technology leader that pulls the United States forward into the 21st century.
The candidate's rhetoric reflects the public's interest in space. Washington's Air and Space Museum is the most popular museum in the world. To find out more details about public attitudes to space and national policy, NOVA commissioned a poll from the Public Opinion Laboratory at Northern Illinois University.
When we asked people what they perceive to be the major achievement of the United States in the area of science and technology, Overwhelmingly, people tell us the space program, the shuttle, communication satellites, and things of that kind.
Even before Discovery's successful flight, 78% of Americans rated themselves interested or very interested in space, and 66% considered themselves moderately to well-informed.
In contrast to an issue like nuclear power, where there's a pro-group and an anti-group, in space there is no anti-group.
But is public interest enough to shape national policy?
I think space is a presidential issue because to do it well involves mobilizing the total resources of the country and committing them to goals that are in the broad national interest. And we only have one person in this society that we elect to do that job, and that's the president.
The American public loves the space program, and poll after poll has shown that. The problem is the American people love all the programs. They love health research, they love drug enforcement, they love Social Security cost of living adjustments. And when you love everything, it makes it very difficult for the politicians to decide what programs they're going to cut in order to meet budget deficit guidelines.
Beyond the rhetoric of support for space, what are the specific policies of the candidates? Both support a space station of some kind and cost. Both believe in exploring the solar system with robotic probes. Both would bring space policy decisions closer to the White House. But they differ on the national aerospace plane. Bush is in favor, Dukakis against all but initial research. And as for the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, Bush is in favor and Dukakis again opposes anything but research. In this program, you will hear the candidates discuss their priorities and goals, where we should go in space, and how we should pay for it. But how do they address the deeper issues of the American space program, issues that the Challenger accident forced us to confront? Beyond the human tragedy, Challenger was a failure of policy as well as technology. It revealed a profound managerial weakness in NASA and a space program that had lost its way. In the past, competition has energized America's space program, but now the international space environment has changed. From Sputnik on, America's most obvious rival was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union relies on a proven stable of mass-produced and dependable booster rockets, like this updated version of the Vostok launcher, which took the first man into space in 1961, and which now delivers cargoes and crews to Soviet space stations. The Proton, as powerful as the American Titan rocket, was first launched in 1965 and is now being offered commercially. And there is the Energia, the world's largest operational booster, successfully tested in 1987. Energia may soon launch the Soviet Space Shuttle, shown in this official Soviet videotape. Bold missions to Halley's Comet and to the moons of Mars are establishing the Soviets as leaders in the international space science community, while the U.S. has not launched a planetary mission in more than a decade. Europe has now established an independent space program.
Europe is on the threshold of a new space.
It has ambitions both in science and in commerce. The European Space Agency is developing a piloted mini-shuttle known as the Hermes. And Japan is aggressively developing its own launchers for manned and unmanned missions. How well is the U.S. competing in this new international environment? Take the case of Landsat. Landsat is one of the family of American weather and Earth resources satellites which have revolutionized our view of the world. Landsat 1 was launched in 1972, a product of the optimistic dawn of America's space age. 4 more Landsats were eventually built and sent into polar orbit approximately 500 miles up, covering almost the whole planet every 18 days. Nearly 2 million images have been collected, revealing information about crops, geology, erosion, pollution, flooding. Landsat imagery was public and cheap, and it became an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia were among the 13 nations that built and operate ground stations. But in 1979, as part of a new policy of privatization, Landsat was transferred from NASA first to the Department of Commerce, and in 1985 to a new private company, EOSat. The government agreed to pay EOSat $250 million to keep the program going. The first $90 million was paid as promised. But the administration held up a second installment of $62 million. Relying on an agreement that took 14 months to negotiate, Chuck Williams of EOSat was shocked.
Commerce, as part of the administration, actually reduced the funding level to zero, which meant to us basically that in the second year of a 10-year activity and a 4-year funded activity and contract with the government, the administration had backed out on its commitment to the program.
Up in orbit, Landsats 4 and 5 kept on returning data. But in early 1986, EOSat had to suspend work on their replacement, Landsat 6. Landsats 4 and 5 are now approaching the end of their expected lifetimes. Coddling them to prevent a total gap in data, EOSat switches them on and off.
But by doing that, we're limiting the amount of data that we can take to the ground and have available in order to develop a market. That's where it hurts us directly.
Landsat 6 will not be launched until at least 1991, and now the Commerce Department seems uncertain about the next generation, Landsat 7.
So once the government says, we will not purchase hardware for Landsat, let's say 7, at that point, industry will step in.
If I had a bumper sticker, I'd probably say no more Landsats, in a sense, because we didn't approach it as commercial as we could have. Probably the most commercial lesson to be applied in Landsat is that Landsat 7 be built, owned, and operated by EOSat, and we just buy the data.
Privatizing Landsat is a lesson in how to do everything wrong. It was ill-conceived at the start, totally botched in execution, and done in a way that was a sterling example of the fact that the private sector can't trust the government to be stable, reliable in its policies, and therefore can't base private plans on public decisions.
For EOSat and for the nation, this raises a question mark at the very time international competition is more intense than ever.
Image Corporation. And for us,
perhaps the most aggressive competitor is Spot Image, a French company with its American subsidiary, Spot Image Corporation. The Spot 1 satellite was launched by the European Ariane rocket in 1986. Spot's claim to fame is higher resolution. It can see objects on the ground 9 times smaller than Landsat. This is New York Harbor. And this is Chernobyl. In normal circumstances, Spot and Landsat are complementary, since Landsat can analyze the Earth's surface in more ways than Spot. But with the budget-driven delays to Landsat 6, many think that Spot, with its aggressive customer service, will establish a beachhead in the marketplace that will be hard for EOSat to recapture. And Spot has long-term plans.
The Spot program has a commitment already to Spots 2, 3, and 4, and we are already designing Spot 5. This will keep Spot satellites in orbit just about till the turn of the century.
And the Soviets are beginning to offer even higher resolution pictures. They have released this 2.5-meter image of Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Meanwhile, though everyone is hoping there will be no gap in data, it is clear that Landsat has been jeopardized by the lack of a comprehensive space policy and the twists and turns of budget politics.
And there may now be a period of time when there will be no Landsat satellites in operation because of this friction, this tug of war between the two branches of government.
And we're going to find that we are out of the market at a time when the market may be developing the most rapidly, and that is very unfortunate.
Our ability to understand our own planet and help other nations study their territories is hanging on a wing and a prayer. This is not the first time we have faced aggressive competition in space. October 4th, 1957, Sputnik, Earth's first artificial satellite. Senator Lyndon Johnson heads a new committee on space and astronautics. Eileen Galloway was a special consultant.
In the United States, it was primarily astonishment that the Soviet Union was first to get into outer space, and therefore it was a matter of national defense.
President Eisenhower and the Congress respond quickly.
No time was lost at all. And LBJ was very quick in holding hearings and in getting all the experts together that he could to get their advice on this. There was unity between the president and the Congress, even though the president was a Republican and the Congress was Democratic. There was unity between the Department of Defense and the people who were trying to set up a civilian agency.
In April, President Eisenhower urged that space exploration be conducted by a civilian agency, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was formed. NASA was to be the lead agency for all U.S. civilian space activities. And to ensure coordination between NASA and other government agencies, Congress mandated the National Aeronautics and Space Council, at first to be chaired by the President himself, later by the Vice President. By this time, America had already responded to Sputnik with the Explorer 1 satellite, which made the first scientific discovery in space, Earth's radiation belts. NASA began to develop the experimental Mercury project to put men in orbit, and the Mercury 7 became American heroes. By 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had launched himself into the presidency, in part by playing on what turned out to be ill-founded fears of a Soviet lead in missiles. Then a Soviet cosmonaut became the first human in space, and Alan Shepard followed as the first American, and Kennedy upped the ante with the most ambitious goal yet.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
For President Kennedy, it was very much a Cold War decision. He was a pragmatic politician that saw space as a symbol of national competence and said that the United States, if it aspired to be the leading nation in the world, had to be first in space.
Kennedy was backed by Lyndon Johnson, who as Vice President chaired the White House Space Council. And even after Kennedy's assassination, when LBJ was increasingly distracted by the war in Vietnam, he and Congress remained committed to the moon goal. Through the 60s, it was this goal that gave momentum and a string of interim successes to the nation's space program. In 1962, it was John Glenn's first orbital flight. And putting a man on the moon also stimulated unmanned scientific missions.
Space Highlights, 1965.
And gave a clear basis for deciding what to do next.
Saturn I, the first generation in a series of rockets which will ultimately place men on the moon, completed.
And there was technology and energy enough for missions to Mars, probes to the Sun and outer planets, flotillas of weather and communication satellites. Looking back, it's easy to underestimate the difficulty, but success was never assured.
The idea that a nation is exploring right on the edge, right on the cutting edge, is something which I think throughout history has motivated populations to go on and be very productive across the board. The outreach was always into the unknown. Again, not because it was easy, because it was not easy in most cases. It was a very difficult endeavor, and indeed it cost, in each of those periods, cost a great deal of money, resources.
There was agreement between President and Congress, and the focus was on countdowns to the launch of Apollo 11, not on accountants at the Office of the Budget.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. And the
we copy you down, Eagle.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But I think the message of Apollo is also quite clear. When the president decides that it is time for the United States to take the leadership in an exciting mission that's going to capture the imagination of the entire world, and he gives NASA the money and the charge to do that, gives them a time schedule, it's a wonderful way of marshaling all your resources.
Everything about Apollo was larger than life, including its impact, it spawned the microelectronics industry. And learning how to keep astronauts alive and well in space advanced medical technology down here on Earth.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone.
But what happened after Apollo again demonstrated the importance of presidential leadership.
Richard Nixon and his associates made a cold-blooded political calculation that there was no benefit in another grand space program.
Presidential attention was focused instead on Vietnam, protest, détente, China, Watergate.
And NASA and its allies had to struggle to get any major new program approved. And they pared down what originally was just the transportation vehicle for the station into something that could put together a political coalition of support, and that was the shuttle.
In his first spell as NASA administrator, James Fletcher sold the shuttle as a way to lower the cost per pound of getting payloads into orbit. Launch costs, he said, would be 1/10 as much as for Apollo's Saturn V booster. The powerful moon rockets were packed off to become museum pieces, their plans filed away in archives, the machinery that made them sold for scrap. And while Nixon loved astronauts, there were even more compelling reasons for supporting the shuttle.
He and Ehrlichman and others sat down and put the states where there were significant aerospace contracts over the states with key electoral votes for the 1972 election, and discovered that there's very high leverage in the space issue in very important electoral states. And that was clearly a motivation in the decision to go ahead with the significant shuttle program.
But after the election, such political justifications paled. Nixon's Office of Management and Budget hacked away at NASA, and the shuttle design changed in many ways, lowering upfront costs, increasing operating expenses, losing many safety features. And unnoticed to most people, the White House Space Council was abolished.
Short-term politics is almost always a necessary but not a sufficient condition to begin a long-term enterprise like a major space development program.
When Jerry Ford took over from Nixon, he presided over détente in space in the Apollo-Soyuz mission and okayed a Jupiter probe and the Hubble Space Telescope. But under President Jimmy Carter, shuttle costs got out of hand as a result of problems with the thermal tiles and the main engines. And Carter, faced by gas shortages and other crises, saw little value in pushing space. His vice president, Walter Mondale, was in fact a longtime opponent of NASA.
The cost of putting that
More and more, NASA had to justify shuttle in commercial terms as an all-purpose truck to loft all kinds of satellites, cheaper than the old-fashioned expendables. To bring down the cost per launch, the manifest was filled up with future missions in an attempt to make the nation's investment appear to pay off. The shuttle made its first flight in 1981, and Ronald Reagan inherited a program that seemed to be in good shape. Shuttle flights were seen as routine, safe, and adequate for science, commerce, and military security. Public support was as strong as during Apollo.
We can follow our dreams to distant stars, living and working in space for peaceful economic and scientific gain.
It was time for new dreams. In 1983, Reagan announced the Space-Based Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars. In 1984, an $8 billion space station. In 1986, an aerospace plane to allow trips to the Orient in 2 hours.
I think Ronald Reagan recognized the nationalistic, the symbolic values of space more than any president since John Kennedy. His whole personal inclination was to be strongly pro-space.
But along with this new hardware came a new policy of commercialization, justifying space activities by their economic potential.
He was sold a bill of goods, I think, on the commercial value of space, and that was congenial to his ideology, and so he accepted it.
It's quite clear, and as a believer in the American industrial base, we certainly cannot expect American industry and the CEOs today to change to fit space. It's rather that space has to change to fit into the American business climate. And by that, it means you have to have access to space on a regular or predictable basis.
But midway through Reagan's second term came the Challenger accident, and access to space was seen as anything but routine and safe. Now, before commercialization, there had to be recovery. After the accident came a drumbeat of criticism. The Rogers Commission, the National Academy of Sciences, and internal NASA studies. In 1988, the Reagan administration announced a new space policy, taking into account the lessons of Challenger. But seasoned observers noted some curious features. For one thing, the press conference, though held in the White House, lacked the president. Next, it featured not just NASA Administrator James Fletcher, but also Secretary of Transportation James Burnley and Secretary of Commerce C. William Verity. And finally, the policy turned out to be as much about commerce as about space.
The policy recognizes the existence of a separate commercial sector as well, and reaffirms the President's strong commitment to encouraging a healthy and expansive commercial space industry.
Space is just a place to do business. This is another place where business can thrive. New jobs are created.
The specifics blended this commercial slant with longtime NASA concerns. First, a commitment to getting the shuttle flying again. Second, plans for new heavy lift rockets to supplement the shuttle. Third, a pledge to advance the space station, NASA's follow-on project to the shuttle. Fourth, endorsement of a mini space station to be privately owned and known as the Commercially Developed Space Facility, or CDSF. Fifth, plans to help a domestic launch industry run by private companies get off the ground. The most ambitious idea was to expand the human presence away from Earth orbit out into the solar system. This was accompanied by a plan for the Pathfinder project, intended to develop the advanced technology for such future exploration. On the surface, it sounded like a space enthusiast dream, but when it came to implementation, there were problems.
Well, the Reagan administration will leave a legacy of rhetoric with respect to space.
And it's necessary to have a program to go with the policy and then a budget to go with the program to pay for it. And they don't follow through on this, and it's not all coordinated at the top.
First of all, we need goals, but then we need a president who will follow up. And to be very candid about it, this president has not followed up enough on his goals. And what that means is he must be engaged on a daily basis during the appropriations process. That means he's calling individual senators.
President Reagan has expressed himself as being a big advocate of the space program, doesn't want to see us be second best. Quite often, though, through the past 8 years, the budgets asked for and the support to fight for those budgets on Capitol Hill has been lacking.
What progress has been made to implement the 1988 policy? What key decisions are left for the next president? There's no debate about the immediate need to get the fleet of shuttles flying safely. There's no short-term alternative, and several major payloads like the Hubble Space Telescope are so large as to be shuttle-dependent. But continuing debate and indecision has characterized NASA's other major undertaking, Space Station. A permanent base in orbit has been the dream of almost every space visionary. It was one of the options presented to President Kennedy in 1961, but he chose the more immediate and exciting payoff of the moon race. But with the approval of the shuttle, NASA started calling a space station the next logical step. In 1971, the Soviets orbited their first small station, Salyut, and have continually upgraded their stations until the 8th, Mir, was launched in 1986. In 1973, NASA put up Skylab, far larger than any Soviet station, including Mir, but sent up only 3 missions. Just as with the Saturn V booster, the U.S. abandoned the field when it was ahead. In recent years, concern that the Soviets might be onto something we have given up has seemed a useful selling point for Space Station, as seen in this commercial produced by one of the major contractors.
Valuable metal alloys are being created, and new scientific data that could literally change the course of history are being collected every minute. Shouldn't we be there too? Write your support to get us into space.
In 1984, the president had been told the cost would be $8 billion and that it would fly in 1994. Now, the price tag is at least $16 billion, with more for launch costs and support, and the date has slipped to 1997. Over the years, there have been changes in design, delays that cause increases in cost, and studies by panel after panel. America's space station would be nearly 5 times larger than the Soviets' Mir, a more comfortable place in which to work, and it's planned to have almost 7 times more electrical power for experiments and research on materials processing. But what exactly is it for? Some scientists and engineers argue that an all-purpose research facility designed for everything will end up good for nothing.
To me, it's more of an engineering problem now than a total conflict between the many sciences, and you can add the astrophysics or the plasma physics onto it, that want to look out or look back at the Earth. The capability is there with which to accommodate virtually all of these sciences.
Well, I think the idea of deciding on a space station is an incremental step because it's the next logical movement into space, and then leaving unsaid where you go beyond that is a completely backwards way to do it.
The other issue that has slowed down space station is funding. Since 1985, Congress has appropriated over $1 billion less than requested. But it was rather different this year when the House of Representatives debated a proposal to strip $400 million from NASA, mainly from space station, to spend on housing and other social programs.
So we must make choices, and choices we are here to make today.
Do all of us benefit some by going to Mars and Jupiter and Venus this year? Or do we say we'll put off Mars, Jupiter, and Venus so that the crushing burden of homelessness is a little bit lessened?
Mr. Chairman, we always hear about don't eat the seed corn. Well, this is exactly what this program is doing. It's eating the seed corn. How can we ever expect to reap the harvest if we're not going to have the funds for planting?
Those who would explore the stars should not forget those who must live under them. And those who live under them also lived under the storms of hardship. They look to the stars in anguish, asking why they must suffer so that satellites may fly overhead. Invest in our future. Invest in our people. Vote to fund the homeless program with the money it needs.
The time is at hand where we've got to stand up. To nitpick a dollar here and a dollar there is a terrible mistake to the future of this country and for everybody involved in it. And I ask every member to vote vigorously.
Eventually, a budget including $900 million for space station was passed to the president as the House defeated the amendment.
And the amendments on block are not agreed to.
But over the next 2 years, an additional $5 billion will be required. What do the candidates think? Michael Dukakis.
I've made a very strong commitment to it. There are certain very important benefits which one gets from a manned space station, from the doing of experiments in space which are unique and very important to us. And we should continue with those, and one of the reasons for the manned space station is to develop those kinds of technologies. I should say one other thing as well. We all know that the next administration is going to face very serious financial problems. We're going to be left with about $1.5 trillion more debt than we had 8 years ago. We're going to be looking at budget deficits of at least $140 to $150 billion. And that, too, will require some choices to be made.
Nova caught up with George Bush at Edwards Air Force Base during the return of the shuttle Discovery. Bush also endorses space station as the next step in the space program.
Of course, the space station is a goal that I would establish as the president.
Republicans argue that an expanding economy will pay for space station without the need for cuts elsewhere. The space station is not yet past the point of no return. How hard to push it will be a major decision for the new president. Arguments about space station design and cost are part of the normal and ongoing debate about priorities within NASA. But in the Reagan years, a new criteria has been used to judge the nation's space program: how much opportunity it affords for commercial interests to participate in space.
I mean, that's radical. And yet it's radical in one sense, and yet it's entirely consistent with this president's economic policy of non-governmental interference in domestic and economic policy decisions that occur out in the private sector.
This has meant support from the Department of Commerce for a mini space station designed by a Houston company, Space Industries Incorporated, and known as the Industrial Space Facility. ISF was intended as a privately owned, lower-cost factory for products originally researched on shuttle and later aboard space station. 1/10 the size of Space Station with less power, it would be man-tended, not permanently occupied. But after Challenger, private investment dried up, and space industries came to Washington looking for some kind of government participation. ISF was cast as a useful tool until Space Station could fly. Congress agreed and authorized $25 million even without being asked. But some say ISF became a vehicle to attack NASA's space station. Until September 1988, Courtney Stadd was director of the Office of Commercial Spaceflight for the Department of Transportation.
And I think there were some people in the administration, again, who were hell-bent on privatizing as much of the civil space program as possible.
Fearing a raid on their funds, NASA faced a pitched battle with Commerce Secretary Verity and other ISF supporters. Eventually, a plan was devised for the government to guarantee $700 million rent over 5 years so space industries could get a bank loan. As a result of this infighting, all mention of space policy was omitted from the 1988 State of the Union address.
I think that the conflict between NASA and the Department of Commerce, between Administrator Fletcher and Secretary Verity, was more nasty than the normal domestic kind of political controversy. Integrities being questioned, people being called liars. It created an atmosphere of conflict and antagonism that certainly was not conducive to effective policy choice.
Was this just politics as usual, or did it have a deeper meaning?
This is part of the whole privatization thing, where you're going to privatize everything under the sun. They had studies going over there about privatizing the Postal Service, selling it off and letting it being run as a commercial enterprise. Studies going on with regard to making the Coast Guard, privatizing the Coast Guard. We contract for those services.
All in all, not the concept, but the way it was handled in the policy process has really been a very strong negative factor in space policy.
Now suspicious of the mini space station, Congress withdrew support. So for the next several years, the nation will have to rely on the already heavily scheduled shuttle for experiments in space. But here, shuttle's capacity may well be enhanced by another project, where commercialization seems to be working. SpaceHab, headed by Jim Biggs, has developed a module that takes up about 1/4 of the shuttle cargo bay. SpaceHab is a spare room with an extra set of mid-deck lockers, where shuttle crews stow equipment or small experiments are performed. SpaceHab doubles the pressurized volume of the shuttle. SpaceHab relies on the shuttle for its launch, but will pay NASA only after it is earning money. Unlike space industries, it's truly private. There's no government contract or guarantee. Another major issue involving private industry is how to build and operate the expendable rockets that all the studies after Challenger called for to supplement the shuttle. The basis for this policy was the 1984 Commercial Space Launch Act, designed to encourage private launch capability. The Department of Transportation was in charge, but with the shuttle flying, no one took it very seriously.
What's changing is that we've now got the United States government sending a very clear signal to the private sector that it will no longer attempt in any way, shape, or form to monopolize within the boundaries of this country this business.
The policy is beginning to work. Many smaller companies are now manufacturing rockets. The Department of Transportation has become a one-stop shop for a launch license. And previously restricted facilities like this one at Edwards Air Force Base are now open to private companies. The American rocket company, AMROC, is at work on innovative hybrid engines, combining solid and liquid fuels. There's Orbital Sciences Corporation, with plans for Pegasus, a rocket launched from beneath the wing of a B-52 to boost lighter payloads to low Earth orbit. These companies may be the wave of the future, exemplifying the Reagan dream of letting 1,000 entrepreneurs bloom. But at the same time, the nation's more established aerospace companies are facing a crisis of international competition. Until the Challenger accident, there was little opportunity for the larger companies like Martin Marietta, General Dynamics, and McDonnell Douglas to sell their Titan, Atlas Centaur, and Delta rockets. Back then, to create the appearance of commercial success, all civilian and most military satellites had to fly on the shuttle. But after Challenger came a change in policy, and the Big Three geared up to sell not rockets, but launch services to private industry and also to the government. To take advantage of the economies of scale, General Dynamics committed to 18 Atlas rockets on spec without guaranteed customers. And in May 1988, there was a contract from the Air Force to buy 11 launches. But satellites service the entire globe, and the world market is increasingly competitive. This is the control room of the world's first commercial space transportation company. The language spoken here is French. This is the Ariane 4 rocket, the equivalent of an American Titan. It's May 1988, the day of its first launch. Arianespace is a partnership between governments and industries from 10 European nations. French interests hold over half the shares, and there's close cooperation with both the French National Space Agency and the European Space Agency. Arianespace claims to have secured over 50% of the market for the launching of the nearly 200 commercial and scientific satellites from the West that will go into orbit in the next decade.
4, 3, 2, 1, feu! Allumage. Décollage.
American companies won't start launching till 1989, and even then they are not sure that they can compete with such government-assisted foreign companies. In China, American companies are competing with the government itself. China has plans for an astronaut corps and a growing stable of rockets. This one is called the Long March. Though relatively unproven, China is charging very low rates to fly on it, about 30% lower than a comparable American launch. For an Australian satellite, Hughes Aircraft applied for an export license to ride aboard the Chinese rocket. In the interests of free trade and foreign policy, the administration said yes.
Should we keep payloads off a Long March, for example? My personal opinion would be no, because the only thing that will create an incentive in our market will be the specter of foreign competition taking our payloads and launching them.
Here again, an inconsistency. On the one hand, President Reagan several years ago articulated most eloquently a policy of building up commercial space enterprise in America. And with the other hand, the administration comes in and cuts off at the knees that commercial space enterprise.
To allow the Chinese, which are motivated by non-market considerations, who set their policies, their pricing policies by their own admission, based on political or administrative considerations, to allow them to enter the marketplace, in my judgment, is foolhardy.
Each launch lost by an American company increases the trade deficit by the equivalent of 7,000 foreign cars. A supply of expendable launch vehicles is a strategic necessity, but can American companies compete? In September, the French Ariane launched its first exclusively American payload of 2 satellites. And on the horizon are the Japanese, whose H-1 rocket is already operational and whose H-2 is scheduled to fly in 1992. So while the debate about commercial launch vehicles may seem as if it's about commerce and bureaucratic turf, it's really also a question of the national interest. And the way these policy decisions are being made is what worries many observers.
The Department of Commerce, I have had some harsh criticism for, because they basically have been getting into an area trying to make space policy that they don't know anything about, and they've purposely been elbowing NASA aside, the agency that has some expertise in this area.
Interagency, we are probably not welcome, but we are welcome in the business community. They're happy to see us there because if business is in space, they want someone who understands business at the policy table to explain it to those who don't.
But I think we went to the extreme. And I think what you ended up with were agencies that knew something about economics but knew nothing about space technology, and instead you ended up with a great deal of illiteracy amongst several of the key players in terms of space.
I think the focus during the Reagan administration on commercialization has been a detriment to a well-crafted space policy. It's introduced interests that have brought kind of economic/political ideologies to play, not backed up by any technical reality. It's given those people a seat at the center table of space policy. It's caused all kinds of expectations in the Congress and the American public overseas to be raised that I don't think have any foundation to them. So I think it's diverted us from the main course.
We asked the two candidates how they think commercialization has worked. Every indication is that a Bush administration would continue the present policies.
Strong emphasis there, and I think the future is unlimited in terms of privatization and commercial use of space, commercial applications.
But a President Dukakis would be more cautious.
About that. I'm somebody who believes deeply in partnerships, and obviously the private sector's got to be involved, but I want to make sure that we're providing the kind of strength and leadership we must, and doing so in a way that will make our launch capability, will make our program the best and keep it the best.
Whatever their differences, both candidates would coordinate space policy through the reinstitution of the National Space Council, and both would place their vice presidents in charge. For the Democrats, Lloyd Benson, a Texan, has ties to the Johnson Space Center. He is a longtime supporter of Space Station and sits on the Senate committee which oversees NASA. Republican Dan Quayle has more experience with military than civilian space, but a party spokesman says Quayle strongly supports NASA and links space with technology and education. No candidate has yet proposed a major goal. President Reagan's was ambitious but vague.
That for the first time, the United States has a long-range goal of expanding human presence and activity beyond Earth orbit into the solar system.
There would seem to be considerable popular support for this. When the Nova poll asked whether the U.S. should explore space in the same spirit as the Europeans of Columbus's era, the answer came back yes, 71% to 27%.
For America to turn its back on space on the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, to me would not be the America that I know. I can't imagine our people sitting in front of television sets watching other nations open bases on the moon, begin the exploration of Mars, without having Americans in a leadership position.
Do we want in the next decade or 2 decades to see the kids of the world going to Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow for their education if we lay down the leadership in space?
But unlike Kennedy's crisp and focused goal, the moon and back in a decade, expanding the human presence still begs questions of exactly where to go, what to do, and when, and therefore how and with what technology. Not that there aren't many exciting options. Astronaut and Rogers Commission member Sally Ride was asked to evaluate NASA's goals. She came up with these ideas: a mission to planet Earth to track the changing environment, a permanent base on the moon, human missions to Mars, and robotic exploration of the solar system. The poll found no clear preference. Space Station was endorsed by 76%, Mars missions by 54%, and a moon base by 52%. And since JFK's moon goal was at first opposed by more people than supported it, it seems that space programs are made by leaders, not by followers. So what do the presidential candidates propose?
Well, I haven't spelled them out in terms of the goal, in terms of the longer range, but I do believe that I would like to build on Dr. Sally Ride's report, Mission to Planet Earth, and be sure we maximize the benefits that are out there from space. I mean, in medicine and weather, environment. And so that would be a short-run, firm, achievable goal, but that does involve men in space. I am committed to the concept of men in space. I don't want it to be impersonal, strictly machines there. And so I would start there and then build immediately on that with a further goal, which would be exploration of outer space.
this is going to have to be a step-by-step process in which we try to take the resources we have and match them with the goals that we have. Right now, I think our most important priority is to pull that program together, manage it well, make sure that it works well, proceed with our plans for an occupied space station and for collaboration and cooperation with our allies, and then we'll take it step by step from there.
Then I think you need to set a longer goal. Where do we go further out into space, whether it's Mars or what future goal? But that should be set by the next president after a proper study.
As we begin to get this country's fiscal house in order, as we also invest in important domestic priorities, it'll be a combination of those two, which I think will determine just how far and how fast we move.
Whatever we choose will be expensive. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that just to carry out the already approved program will cost over $14 billion in 1993, over $16 billion in the year 2000. And putting the RIDE report into effect could cost $30 billion a year. But keeping the budget at its present $11 billion could mean no space station at all.
In an absolute sense, it's a large amount of money. We spend 10 or $12 billion a year. In a relative sense, it's a small amount of money. The federal budget this year is over $1 trillion. The $10 billion that we spend on space research and development activities is less than 1% of the federal expenditures, less than 1/4% of the gross national product. My view is that the American people are willing to spend that much money.
We're eating our seed corn in a way, and we are receiving the benefits today from Congresses in the past who were willing to fund NASA properly back in the days of Apollo and all of the spin-offs that came from those great days of NASA. We are enjoying the benefits of those efforts today.
The Nova poll found that the public agrees 60% to 38% that the space program has more than paid for itself.
I think that there is a political basis for a space program of significantly, but not massively greater size, required to carry out exploration, to seek challenging objectives, not to just be a truck service and a commercial enterprise. I think that's not what the American public wants out of its space program.
What does the public want out of its space program? In the beginning, rivalry with the Soviet Union made us acutely aware of the military aspects of space. But when asked what should be the future justification, only 25% said military security, 11% commerce, and 54% scientific exploration. In comparing military and civilian space budgets, 22% accept the status quo, 16% want more military expenditures, and 62% want more civilian. But without decisions on goals, perhaps talk of budgets is putting the cart before the horse.
You don't start out with a budget and say, okay, here's the money, how are we going to spend it? You ought to start out with your goals and objectives. Here are the important things we want to do. How much will it cost to do them? And then provide adequate funds for that.
I would like to see us establish a goal to have a manned mission to Mars. And once you've established that goal, then the space program expands behind it. And that is not nearly as difficult to achieve, as technologically speaking. It's when John Kennedy said, we will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
I think there is real public support for imaginative, worthwhile, believable space endeavors. The public has a crying desire, the American public especially, to believe in itself, its own future. And space, like going to Mars, is a symbol of where we want to be. It's a symbol of our future. And it generates tremendous support.
The United States can decide it wants to be in the vanguard of that outward movement that will really be one of the key elements of the 21st century, or it can turn inward and say we're going to do other things and let history make the judgment of whether that was right or wrong.
In the Middle Ages, if people were building a cathedral, they would take 100 or 200 years and they would still do it. And they never wavered. You know, if it took 8 generations or 10 generations, you know, they knew what they were doing, and they were building these spires to reach to the heavens. And now we have better technology for reaching to the heavens, and we should do it.
Now the shuttle has flown, it's easy to assume that the American space program is A-OK. In this hour, we asked, can the next president win the space race? But as every marathon runner knows, ultimately, the race is with yourself. As a nation, will we go to museums, not to launch pads, to see our dreams of flight? Is our future all behind us? As Eisenhower and Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson realized, how history will remember us is partly written in what we and the next president we elect choose to do in space.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide, and Prime Computer, supplying integrated computer solutions to the world's manufacturing, commercial, technical, and scientific marketplaces. Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to NOVA Transcripts, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts 02134. Please be sure to include the show title.